Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. I'm hoping that somehow at the end of this 50 minutes or so, you'll just love, really, the smallest things that we share this planet with that are under our feet all the time, and they are struggling. And it's connected to the sonic, no, what do you call it, Alan?
Sonic spider?
It is sonic spider.
It
so
is,
there was, if you may have seen earlier this week, an exhibit which Alan brought to the festival where you could interact. We'll see a picture of it in a short while.
Oh, right. Good.
But these pictures are pictures that Alan has taken from a meadow that he is rewilding in Exeter, which is on the other side. So this is Alan Anderson, who I should confess is an old colleague of mine from when we used to work at Nature magazine. He then went on to greater things and became editor-in-chief at New Scientist. So it's kept lots of people educated.
You went on to the BBC. That's much more grand.
Not at all. And then, sorry, I'm going to go to Beth first. So Beth Mortimer is very interested in small spiders, which is why you just came back from Kenya looking at elephants.
That's
And Claire Carvell is from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is by the Thames, I think, pretty close to the Thames. Is it in Wallingford? And I don't actually know. You're in charge of looking after all our little things.
Well, yeah, I'm an ecologist, and I do lots of stuff, especially with pollinators as well.
Yeah. So if we go to the slide set, I don't know how we're going to start this. Alan.
Yep.
I am going to start with you because, in a sense, you were the seed of this, and you were telling me about. So you've bought up a meadow in. Well, it's part of your house. Is it down at Devon?
Yeah, that's right, outside of Exeter, and I was extremely lucky. You can see some pictures of it going by. It's a couple of acres of meadow that's just been cut once a year for at least 35 years, perhaps much longer. And it is incredibly full of wildlife. Just recently it's become a county wildlife site because of its biodiversity. But I never talk about the biodiversity first when I talk about this meadow. What I want to talk about is the incredible beauty of this place. And it's a beauty that changes constantly. So starting about next month, we'll get the first phase of the yellow celandines filling this meadow, a couple of acres. And after that will become the purple phase of orchids and bluebells. Then there'll be another yellow phase as we go into buttercups and onwards into hawkweeds and that kind of thing. And we'll end in July with another purple phase as the hardheads, or knapweeds as we call them, come there. And there'll be marvellous things like meadow sweet and so on, and lady's bedstraw, all with evocative names filling this meadow. So I see this as this meadow is, first of all, the kind of something so beautiful and wonderful that anybody who's been there, I think, would like to make one of their own. And you can. So if you've got a small patch, you can make a small meadow, and you will at the same time have done something marvellous for biodiversity, because it's full of insects and creatures going by.
And so this one?
Yeah, and that's an oil beetle. And oil beetles are really great things to have in your meadow because despite their sort of slightly humanly weird appearance with a rotating head, is they are effectively, their young climb up flower stems and wait till a bee comes by, cling onto the bee and go back to the bee nest and then go and eat the bee's honey for food to bring up their young. That's a sort of simplified version of it. But you know, if you've got lots of oil beetles in your meadow, then you've got lots of bees, and if you've got lots of bees, you've got lots of flowers. So when you've got these, you know, this is a good sign you've got something wonderful.
I mean, I'd be curious, does anyone find this picture quite disgusting?
Disgusting? My God.
Well, but I think that's part of the thing, is that so many of the small things make people, they resile from it then.
Yes, and
I think it's going deeper than that is the question.
Yep. And what I try to do is to encourage people to think, what's it like to be this beast? What do they sense? What do they feel? What's their world like? And if you go beyond just looking at species or naming them and start to ask, what's it like to be inside them, have their senses, have their lives, then the world becomes very, very interesting indeed. And it's a kind of another level you can move beyond in natural history. But there are people here who know so much about how these creatures' worlds are that I shall shut up.
Well, Claire, sorry, Beth, you go into the side of the world of the spider. So let's start. Go to what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a researcher. So I teach and I do research. But what my group focuses on is how animals use vibrations for information. So we've mentioned that there's a little bit there to do with spiders, a little bit to do with elephants. What they all have in common is that they use vibrations through materials as part of their input. So we tend to be quite focused on our 5 senses. So 2 of them, hearing and touch, are all to do with basically being able to feel motions. So I'm interested in how animals sense motions in other ways. And my first love will always be the spiders. So that's where my research journey started. And just to start off, that spiders are not insects, just to make that clear to everyone. But they are invertebrates and they are closely related to insects. But spiders will always be my first love. And think of a spider on its web. Essentially, a lot of their world, how they sense their world, is how their web is moving. So they have 8 legs and they have basically essentially ears on all of their 8 legs, but what they're detecting is how that web is moving. So what the research in my group does, it looks at lots of different animals, elephants on the ground, spiders on their web, but yeah, we do research, I'm sure we'll go into what specifically I do, basically about how they sense the world around them, and I'm trying to decode what it is they're trying to detect in that way.
And by the end of this session, we're going to love spiders as well.
Oh, absolutely, just as much as I do, yeah.
Claire, I keep on hearing about Insectageddon. You're doing surveys across the whole country, so give us a sense of where we are at the moment and why we should love insects.
That's right, yes. So there are a lot of messages out there, obviously globally, about how the climate's changing and how that's impacting some of our most important ecosystems and, of course, the insects that are in them. Where I work at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, we've spent the last 50 or so years trying to actually map and understand how populations of species are changing over time. And we've done a lot of that work with the insects. And actually, some of the data that we have in the UK for butterflies and moths is some of the best in the world. So if we go to some of the monitoring schemes where we know, again, we have some really good quality data, we do find that those insects are declining. So with the butterflies, for example, we've got about 58 resident species of butterfly in the UK. And the last report showing that 80% of those species have declined in either their numbers, their abundance, or the distributions, the areas over which they're found. Especially in farmland areas and some parts of the countryside, some butterfly species have declined by as much as 70% or more. And we look at the moths as well. We have some really good long-term monitoring schemes for moths where they're being monitored at the same sites in the same way year on year. And we found that their sort of total abundance, the overall abundance of moths has declined by about 1/3 in the last 50 or so years in the UK. So we've got about 41% of the species that have decreased. Having said that, there are some winners. So there are many losers, but there are some species that are doing okay. So about 10% of moths have increased. And we see fairly parallel types of change within the other insects that we've been monitoring. So the bees and the hoverflies, for example, a lot of that data is reported in a really great report called The State of Nature as well, The State of Nature of the UK. So you can actually go and find the numbers within that report. But there, as I say, there are some species that are doing a little bit better. They're able to kind of exploit maybe some of those niches that other species aren't using, or sometimes moving with the changing climate in a way that favours their lifestyle.
I mean, I'm always surprised that we're going through this in my lifetime, because I knew as a child,
Yeah.
how probably Alan, you know, all these wonderful things were under pressure because of insecticides and agricultural practices and blah, blah, blah. And I'm not quite sure why we've not been able to turn that around. To what extent is it things like pesticides or ploughing up land? Is it land use? What are the drivers that are doing this?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, the overall driver has to be general kind of loss of habitat. It's really, since again the intensification of our farming systems, 70% of our landscapes are now farmed. We've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows where many of these insects would have thrived in the past. And so simply the areas of habitat they need to survive and keep their populations healthy have just been made smaller and smaller and smaller and shunted into tinier, tinier patches. And so again, this is when populations become fragmented and they're not able to be successful. So the overall impact is habitat loss. But of course, if you've got less food, less places to live, less places to nest, you then get impacted by other stresses like intensive farming practices such as pesticides. Then you get, again, those populations are already weak and they've just had another extra hammering from things like the pesticides, which, as we know, are having a detrimental effect, particularly on insects like the bees, on their navigation and so on.
I mean, Alun, with your meadow, you've owned it for what?
11 years, but I know the history of it a bit longer.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's the transformation? What was it like? Why was it like that when you started?
Yeah, well, we don't know why previous owners had never cultivated it or grazed it, but we do know at one time the buildings there were used as a special school, and they did have a donkey, but nothing else. So I think maybe we were very lucky that gave us this meadow. But I think just following on from what you were saying, 97% of meadows have disappeared since the 1920s, which means, and those were all incredibly flower-rich. Flower-rich means pollinator-rich, means wonderland. But I wonder when we talk about this, I'd be interested to know what the audience thinks actually. Some of the oldest meadows we have in Britain are as old as medieval cathedrals, and they're every bit as beautiful. Should we be stressing not so much this biodiversity word, but stressing the incredible beauty of these places and that they're treasures? It just takes me back to one time when I wrote a book about the Arctic, I tried to get over ice loss to people using pictures of the globe, and it didn't move people. But when I showed them a particular habitat of sea ice and these very fragile Arctic poppies that grow there, and I said, I've been there, this is a fantastically beautiful picture, you'll never see it because it's about to be destroyed. People started shouting and saying, it's like slashing the Mona Lisa, you can't do that. So I just wonder, do people in this room feel we should talk about the incredible beauty of these places and the beauty of our creatures, or should we be giving you numbers? If that's a good question.
The beauty, definitely. Yeah.
I agree with the beauty. I'm now wishing I'd loaded some of these pictures up in the. I don't have a camera like you, Alun, but a couple of days after Christmas, I was up on the Ridgeway. It's incredibly foggy, and my wife and I we were just mesmerised by the spider webs, which were everywhere, all over the grass, over the seed heads, in the shrubs and things, and they were all dripping. So you could suddenly see them because they were all dripping with little drops of mist that they'd caught, and they were everywhere. And it was the pure beauty, but there were so many different varieties, and they're hidden. They're absolutely invisible unless you have a frost or that dew. And so I think for me, they go hand in hand, because I was thinking, here's this little refuge of richness, of diversity. And I don't know where to go to you, Beth, and talk about spider webs, but Claire, very quickly, the richness does matter, because they are eating each other or helping each other, blah, blah, blah. But the richness is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of scientific research that shows that ecosystems or habitats that are more diverse, that have more species, that have what we call better sort of distribution of functions in those species, all the different things that those species are doing. There's lots of evidence that those systems are not only healthier as functioning ecosystems, but they tend to produce better crops, better yields on crops, fields that have, again, more biodiversity, more natural predators on the ground. Again, it's the whole healthy ecosystem. Just having one or two species performing those roles in itself won't be enough. And of course, it's a risky strategy as well, because if you lose one of those species, then you don't have the backup and the resilience.
Those webs, though. Okay, so a lot of the ones I saw were the funnel webs, so they look like a right mess. The classic web, okay, you've already hinted at this, is these radial bits that go out and then rings of stuff.
Yeah, so
They're not just for catching. That's your point, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So, so these are called orb webs. So, kind of the classic web that you think about. It's flat. It looks like a disc. You've got like bicycle spokes that are coming into the middle. Those are called the radial threads. You've then got a capture spiral that's very sticky. That's there around it as well. So obviously people associate it with a fly or something goes in, it's able to catch the fly, the spider can then get a meal. But what my research has focused on is, yes, it does that, but it also transmits information very quickly to the spider. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't looked recently at an orb web and a spider on there are actually a couple of tips I can give you. So firstly, if you're lucky enough to kind of see a spider on its web, you'll be able to see that very quickly if something does go in there, that they're within less than a second able to not only know that something's hit their web, but they know it's something that they want to go and catch, and they know where it is, and they go off in the right direction. So if you just think about all of those steps they're able to do, basically within tens of milliseconds, they're able to make all of those decisions and go and catch a meal. And that's all due to the motions, very, very tiny motions that are moving through the silk fibres. And I'm particularly interested in that because the spiders are fascinating because essentially they're engineers. If you think of any animal in the world apart from humans, it's actually engineers, it's actually spiders that are the best engineers after humans. They make their own silk material. So their web is made from protein inside themselves. They pull it out of their bodies in very specific ways that changes the properties of these protein fibers. And they then arrange them so carefully to make these beautiful webs, as you say. So I think part of the fascination, the beauty, why people love these webs is just appreciating that complexity. And as you say, seeing all the different strategies that you see in spiders, it is so fascinating. And it's honestly sparked my curiosity. This was my direction, what I wanted to do with my life. Yeah.
I mean, to dig into that a bit, you see, it seems to me that this is a real engineering challenge. There are different things that web needs to do. It's got to be elastic so that it can survive in the environment. Presumably it's got to have the sticky surfaces which will catch the passing insect. And I was reading one of your papers that they don't just make the silk that comes out, but they control the character of the silk as it comes out so that it optimizes this ability to transmit the sound waves.
Yes, no, that's right. So this is starting to feel a little bit like I've got my Oxford undergraduates here. This is something that I teach them. But yes, absolutely. So the web has to be able to maintain its own structure. It has to have a structure that isn't going to be damaged by wind. So actually all the holes it has in the web has a function by itself to be able to not to be damaged by things. You've got to be strong enough that the fly doesn't fly all the way through. And I will correct you, technically it's not elastic, I'm afraid.
Ooh.
So if the web was elastic, which means basically it would act like a trampoline. So you can understand that a trampoline is elastic, it kind of stores energy, returns energy, and you can bounce on that. Imagine if a web was like a trampoline, your fly would be flung out otherwise. So actually it's the opposite of that, it absorbs the energy. Right. So it needs to take the kinetic energy, the movement of the fly, and return it to zero. So what people often ask me, and I do get a lot of queries about spiders, particularly August, September, as you can imagine. People are suddenly like, oh, I remember spiders. Let's ask me about spiders. If you have a spider web, an orb web, where each one of the threads was about the diameter of your little finger. So usually they're about 20th the diameter of your hair. So instead, if you scaled it up to be the diameter of your finger, it could absorb the same amount of energy, so stop that, to zero, as a Boeing 747. So these structures are absolutely astonishing for how they're able to absorb energy. So I often get asked, why aren't we using spider silk in stuff like bulletproof vests, something like that? So bulletproof vests would actually be, made out of spider silk would be better than Kevlar. So Kevlar is what's traditionally used in bulletproof vests. So it could stop bigger or faster bullets, is what I mean by that. But it would stop the bullet about 2 meters after it had passed through you. So that's why we don't have armor protection out of spider silk. But perhaps other applications where it can extend your airbags, that type of thing. Yeah.
So let's go to the orb webs. Oh,
Anybody wants to see how a miracle of silk
beautiful.
emerging from a... I'll pass this around. It's unbelievable. There's one bit you didn't mention, wrapping the prey with yet another silk.
That's right. So
this shows just how many spigots there are.
This
producing
particular
silk.
type of spider is a Araneus diadematus, so it's a garden cross spider, which you'll really commonly see in the middle of their webs. The females actually make 7 different types of silk. So the silk that's used to wrap their prey is a different type of silk that's used in their orb web, but their orb web itself is made out of 5 different types of silk. So again, when you have a look at it, appreciate all the different levels of complexity going into it.
I'm going to ask a question I wasn't planning on at all, but I have wondered this in the past. Do they have sort of 5 little vessels at the backside, which are each putting out different ones, or are they?
That's probably the best picture to answer that from.
Yeah.
It's a shame we don't have it up on the screen, but essentially, if you there's a TED talk where they give a quote for, if you ever get the chance to look at a spider's bottom, I very much recommend that.
Yes.
But essentially, they have little nozzles that are essentially coming out of, you can see the spinnerets, so that's the organ that's kind of on the end of their abdomen. In the spinnerets then, they've got basically different nozzles in that area. When you look under a dissection microscope at a spider's spinneret, as I often have done, basically you know that different nozzles offer different types of silk. So we know from where the silk is coming out what type of silk it is, but essentially the spider knows this as well.
Of course.
So in terms of using the right type of silk in their orb web, they essentially will pull silk out the right nozzle in it, and this is all from a liquid gland that they have in their abdomen, and they've got 7 different types in there.
And does it sort of cure like glue does when it comes out, or it's a liquid, but then it's sort of it's technically a solid? Is when it's a thread?
It's not. I'm trying not to give the technical term for it. The technical term for those that are interested is it's a liquid crystalline polymer. But essentially, what that means is that it's a liquid inside of you, and then you have to pull it out for it to form a dry fibre. So Spider-Man, I'm afraid, is incorrect. All the movies, it wouldn't work if you were to push the silk out. It has to be placed on something and pulled away. And it's the energy of pulling it away that causes essentially the proteins to align, to bond together, to form the dry fibre.
But isn't that amazing? I mean, this is not designed, it's just evolution coming up with these kinds of solutions over, 100, 200 million years?
180 million years in spiders, yes, and it's worth saying that lots of insects make silk as well, so they've come up with the same solution to the problem of how to make a material, but completely independently.
Claire, you do like spiders even though they eat all the other things?
Well, I like them even more now. I'm learning, sitting here thinking, yeah.
Actually, it's interesting. There don't seem to be many spider surveys. The only ones I've read were in Switzerland, which suggested spiders were down to 1% of what they've been, because spiders catch insects, so they're a measure of how much the insects have gone down. Is that true, that we don't have a systematic spider survey in this country?
That's actually a very good question, because actually I can't think, I'm not familiar with an arachnid monitoring scheme.
The British Arachnological Society, do have some data, open access data online. I think it's mostly amateur people that learn how to identify spiders, and then they pass their data onto a central database.
That's curious. Is that? I mean, it's taking us into a different territory. So you depend quite a lot on volunteer work. So to what extent is the ease of finding things, which I guess spiders are very secretive, the ease of identifying them. What are the challenges for people who want to do this?
Absolutely, yes. So here we're talking about what we sort of call biological recording. Yeah, it's recording what's out there, what it's doing, where it is. And as you say, most of the people that have given us our wealth of these biological records over the last century are completely amateur naturalists who just become really expert usually in one particular group, one particular taxon. I have a terrible tendency to focus on the insects, and therefore, because spiders aren't insects, I'm less familiar, or I personally haven't ever plotted, a graph showing the change in the number of spiders. But yes, so we have the Biological Records Centre at UKCEH, and again, it's been working for over 50 years to collate all of these records that are submitted to these recording schemes. You've got recording schemes for the different types of flies, recording schemes for the bees, the wasps, the ants, you name it, the Orthoptera, the grasshopper recording schemes. They're all run by volunteers who are absolutely, dedicated experts in their field. Actually, it's only really in the last 20 or 30 years that those data, those records, they're effectively dots on maps. That people have gone out and said, I've seen this species, I'm going to record where I've seen it, at what time and on what date, and it then goes into a system and it becomes a biological record. But only in the last 20 or 30 years have we really started to see the value of this data in telling us what's happening to the natural world. And that's quite sophisticated modelling, statistical modelling techniques are being used to understand how to get some patterns and trends from these kind of data.
I mean, were there Victorian gentry like Charles Darwin? I know he was into worms, but who went round their domain and said, "I'm going to document every single."
Absolutely, yeah. And there are some beautiful examples. There's a lady up, I think, in Leicestershire there's a very it's probably the most documented garden in the UK, who has records going back over time. But that's one of the slight challenges is you tend to get experts who are, really active in Northamptonshire or down in Devon. And so we get what we call biases in the data. There can be what you might call a sort of a spatial or temporal bias, which means that people are going out doing this recording wherever and whenever they like, and not in a very sort of organised and structured way. And so that's where the sort of the modelling comes in. We need to understand, where those people are doing their recording activity, or have a more structured monitoring scheme, which we'll come on to maybe talk about that in a second, to better understand.
But you sent me some of these. I mean, so most of us, I think what we have, I'll give you the clicker, you can go forwards on the green button. Yeah. But to most of us, these are all bees.
Okay, yeah. So I thought we would just talk a little bit about how to start thinking. So we're into the insects now, and the first picture I've got here, it is a honeybee, and actually, hopefully that's quite familiar to most of you. You can see a really nice wet ball of pollen on its back leg there, in its pollen basket. But when the media are talking about bees, still we often find they're actually talking about honeybees. The honeybee, Apis mellifera, is one species, and it's one species among about 270 different wild bee species that we have in the UK. So here's another one you'll be familiar with, the bumblebees. We've got about 26 species of bumblebee in the UK. And this one, Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee, is actually probably the most common bumblebee in the worldwide. It's very recognisable by those lovely two yellow stripes and the sort of buffy white tail. But actually there are 25 other bumblebee species that all look a bit different stripes, or the brown ones or the black ones. And again, you'll probably find about 6 common species that tend to visit your garden. This one is one of the 240 or so solitary bee species. So again, not many people know that some of the bee species we have go down to really quite tiny, just a few millimetres long. This orange-tailed mining bee, so again you've got the mining bees, the plasterer bees, the pantaloon bees, the leafcutter bees, the wool carder bees, and their names usually relate to what material they use to make their nest. So the mining bees nest, they mine down in the soil usually, sometimes mason bees up in the stonework. And these females, so this female of Andrena, she's busy pollinating this apple flower. Some of these solitary bees are about 200 times more effective than one honeybee in pollinating apples.
Someone once told me to leave some bare ground near my apple tree to encourage that.
Absolutely, that's great advice. So these little ground nesting solitary bees, the females, will be nesting literally in those patches of sometimes quite compacted bare ground. Each female needs to provision each of her nesting holes, so she'll dig a hole and she'll lay a series of eggs into that hole. Each egg will be in a little chamber of its own, accompanied by a ball of fresh pollen, and that pollen is then there for the larva of the egg when it hatches, the baby bee. When that larva's growing, it's eating away at that ball of pollen until it's maturing into an adult and then pupating. And so this is why the pollen, that pollen those bees are collecting for their own young is so important, and it's so important that they have pollen available near to their nest sites to keep them going throughout the season.
I saw a bank by a car park near Cheryl Hill on the A4 towards Devizes that way. And it was just riddled. I mean, it was fantastic just to sit there and watch them because it was riddled with these little holes and all these bees going in and out. I can't remember what time of year.
It might have been ivy bees,
It was
possibly.
in September.
Yeah.
It was in September.
There is
a beautiful bee called the ivy bee, Colites hederae, which only feeds on ivy. So it has that really special niche at the end of the season, and it comes out, and you can sometimes see the ivy is really covered in them. Another lovely solitary bee, I know you like this one, Roland, this is the hairy-footed flower bee. So this is one of the sort of mason bees. These bees actually nest in brick walls. You might find them falling out of your chimney because they quite commonly nest in the mortar of a chimney. And they're quite harmless. Again, usually you can just wake them up and put them outside. The males are brown. And I want you to just start looking now at some of the features of this bee. It's got very long antennae and it's got long eyes down the side of its face. And that's what makes it a bee, partly what makes it a bee. And this photo on the left from Stephen Fawkes shows those amazing plumes that give it its name, the hairy-footed flower bee. I've heard that those plumes are there because the males actually cover the eyes of the female whilst they're mating to stop the females getting distracted. But the photos on the right are my photos, which is the more common vision that you'll get of these bees. They dart around in the spring and amongst the lungworts and the pulmonaria.
I'm going to flip back to my video. One of the points I was making to Claire is that in my garden, one of the things I really enjoy the fact that it's not only me enjoying the garden. Is this going to work? Let's go forwards. There we go.
Oh, that's a male. Yeah, the black
was that a male?
No, sorry, the black is the female. There she is. Yeah.
I'm desperately trying to chase it around in my photography, but I just have a patch of these pulmonaria, the lungwort. This is actually quite quiet.
That's a bumblebee. That's a bumblebee.
It could be, yeah. There are days when there are so many different hoverflies and things all over they apparently, I don't know, are lungwort good for... Are they a specialist thing? Are they? Tell me I'm doing the right thing.
Absolutely, yeah. Lungwort's a fantastic plant, especially in the spring when sometimes there isn't a lot else. I mean, there are the blossoms.
They are out already, and I am seeing bees.
And that's a bumblebee. So that's the Latbombus lapidarius, the red-tailed bumblebee, because you can see again it's got that very clear red orangey tail.
But I like the fact that I'm sharing my garden, my flowers, with all these other creatures. Here, you get back to...
just one or two more. So we were just starting to talk there about sort of what features make a bee. There's another example of those lovely long antennae, the lovely long antennae on this one. So moving on here, hopefully you can see straight away there's something different about this insect. Yes, it is got yellow and black stripes, but its head is completely different. And so we're moving on to the flies. So this is a hoverfly, but what makes it a fly is those big eyes across the top of the head and the tiny little feathery antennae. Okay, so instead of a bee with the long antennae, hoverfly with the big eyes on the top of the head. Hoverflies also have two wings, so one pair of rings rather than the four wings of a bee. And this is just, again, the common twist-tail hoverfly. You'll see that one quite commonly on the yellow flowers. And this one is a really important predator of aphids on crops. So the hoverflies go around and eat those pests, aphids and things on the crops. And so they're a sort of a friend to the farmer or the gardener.
Is it feeding itself there, or is it just resting, or is that a good place to find aphids?
Nectaring and sometimes eating pollen as well. But yeah, so the adults do. And then this is a lovely hoverfly, the Heliophilus pendulus. It's known as the common tiger, but it's also known as the footballer hoverfly because of those lovely stripes on its thorax, the black and yellow stripes. Again, you can see the little stubby antennae and the big eyes. This one's got a really cool larval stage, which lots of hoverflies have, which are called rat-tailed maggots. and they actually live in bits of stagnant water. And they've got an amazing breathing apparatus at the end of their tail that allows them to get oxygen and bring it down. And so this is why it's not just about the flowers, it's about those little scrubby patches of messy habitat in your garden. There's a project called the Hoverfly Lagoons, which encourages people to actually put out buckets of water and leave them for these flies to lay their eggs in to survive. This is a fabulous hoverfly, again still a hoverfly, but the hornet plume horn. And it looks like a hornet because their adults actually will go into social wasps' nests or hornet nests and lay their eggs, and then their larvae will kind of scavenge off the bottom of the wasp's nest. But again, the big eyes and the antennae, and I'll tell you why I've been talking about the features in just one second. And then finally, this absolutely beautiful, it's not a hoverfly, but it's a soldier fly. And my colleague Martin has taken this photo. Apparently this is quite a rare species, I've never seen it, but again, you can just see the beauty close up. Of the flies. And again, the flies is such a diverse family. We've just got thousands of species. So there's no end.
I mean, sometimes when I'm looking at these things, I want to know what all these little flies are, but A, they're moving too fast, and B, I'm terribly lazy. And
well, I'd say you need to go beyond that, because as Beth is talking about how a spider is such a wonderful engineer, and lots of these insects are doing the most amazing things. We sit there, we might be able to name them, they're just sort of passing by. But if we just go back to your first, a honeybee, central place forager like that, it has to learn how to get somewhere, how to get back to its hive, where the flowers are, recognize them, which ones are producing honey, when they're producing honey. It has to get around, be there at the right time, and get back. It has to do this all on an energy budget, knowing that it will run out of fuel if it doesn't do it right. So when these creatures go by, they're not just buzzing around. These are creatures with a mission who know where they're going, when they're going, and in a sense why they're going somewhere, and can get back. And to do that, they have to use things like the sun, so they can see the sun when we can't, because they've got polarized vision that enables them to pick out the sun, and so on. So there's a wonder beyond just knowing their names. There's a wonder of knowing all the amazing things they do, which
I've seen some research. I've seen some research which is that they use electric senses. They can sense the electric field around a flower, and as I understand it, the idea is that if the electric field isn't there, that means another bee has just been there. Is that right?
That's right. Not worth. Shop's empty. Move on.
I mean, but this is. I think this for me. We think of ourselves as so blooming wonderful. But actually, if you think about it, everything has to survive somehow on this planet. They've all come up with these amazing strategies.
Yeah.
And we know so little about so many of them, but there's so much for us to find out and to understand.
This is...
So this was moving on to the beetles. So again, I'm not the beetle person, but this is a photo from my colleague Helen Roy, who, if any of you know anything about ladybirds, will know sort of Helen's name. But overall, we've got 4,000 species of beetle in the UK, and that in itself is amazing. And they're all doing different things and showing different types of behaviour. This little ladybird is very common, 7-spot ladybird, but you can see how much of a job it's doing munching through those aphids. So ladybirds really are our friends out there. They are out there, or they're the farmer's friend. They're doing playing a role as well as showing these incredible behaviours. And I think, a single ladybird can eat up to 60 aphids a day.
You're telling me that aphids are our enemy?
Well,
come on, speak up for aphids.
Natural enemies, and enemies and natural enemies. But no. So again, that's just a really nice visual demonstration of that. And then the next one is going on to the recording, so I don't know where, if you want to.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So that's the last insect.
I'm going to suddenly dart back. I still want to know about the orb webs, which look like such a mess.
So the orb webs.
No, well, sorry, the
tunnel webs.
Tunnel webs.
Or
sorry.
funnel webs, yeah.
Tunnel, yeah.
Yeah. So lots of the other spiders, instead of having a kind of 2-dimensional silk trap, they'll have some kind of messy 3-dimensional. So there's lots of examples of this if you look around. And essentially they're still waiting for something to come in and kind of get trapped in the mess, so it's messy by design. With the idea, things like ants might be going in, getting stuck on there. So it's still there for kind of prey capture. There's a sticky aspect to most of them. And then again, transmitting vibrations to wherever the spider might be set. A lot of them still have that role to also transmit the vibrations to the spider.
I'm astonished because they just look squishy.
Obviously, we're probably speaking about lots of different types of webs together, but even the ones that look like they are squishy, they're not very taut, they're still able to transmit some kind of information. But what we found with the orb weavers is that kind of the tighter the silk threads are, so similar to if you're tuning a guitar, you might turn the peg at the top, that affects how they're able to transmit the vibration. So in general, if it's a tighter web, it's more likely that they're using the vibrations than if it's loose.
I mean, I sort of think of those funnel webs as being sort of inferior. Is that a terrible thing to say?
I think that's because of, our human-centered view on things and how we appreciate the kind of complexity and the almost looks like it's been designed orb webs. As we've already touched upon, there's lots of ways of being successful. And actually, one of the things I have to kind of get my undergraduates not to think about anymore is the idea of trying to make these comparisons. And instead of, in terms of what's better or what's more successful, it ends up being that you've got to appreciate that everything has its own way of surviving. And what we need to appreciate is actually balance in natural systems, not disrupting the balance by human interventions as much as possible. But yeah, I appreciate that there's lots of different ways, example with the spiders, to make webs use silk to capture their prey.
And people, there is arachnophobia out there. I've never understood it, but even people who aren't arachnophobes still think of them as somehow not belonging in a house or whatever. I think a lot of people who see bees just think, oh, that might be a wasp. It's going to sting me. Is there a bit of an uphill battle to try and say, no, this is all part of God's creation kind of thing?
Absolutely, and I think as you were saying as well, just actually encouraging people, not trying to tell them too much actually, but just saying go out there and stop and look. I think is the best way to really appreciate. And even the wasps, I mean, what an incredible, another family of insects that we haven't really mentioned, but there's so much beauty in the wasps in themselves, and absolutely they do get a bad name for no good reason, really.
One of the I mean, I haven't over the years done quite a lot of stories about insects, and with wasps they can recognise their own hive, as it were, their own relatives, just by sensing the waxes on the skin, I think, and they can tell the difference. The chemists struggle to tell the difference between different waxes.
Yeah.
And some of them can recognise faces, as you probably know. There are some species of wasps which can recognise the individual faces of other wasps, which is a very remarkable thing.
Yeah, one of the most successful groups, and Claire will know this, is basically the wasps, the bees, but also the ants. They're all closely related to each other, so they're called Hymenoptera. So all of them have very much this chemical sense, being able to spot their relatives that's shared across them. And it is one of the largest groups out of all the animals present on the world. I think ants by itself is, if you weighed up every single organism that lives in the terrestrial environment, so outside of the water, then they think it's around a third of biomass, it's called, is ants by itself.
Wow.
So it's not just number of species, but number of individuals. So actually, very, very successful. Beetles, of course, being the biggest one. But this group of the ants, the bees, and the wasps together. And that chemical sensing that they have is fascinating.
Yeah. We've only got a few minutes left,
okay.
And you run every year a kind of a census.
Yes. So if anyone's keen to go out and do some spotting and actually tell us about what you've seen. There are various ways of doing it. This first one is actually the app iRecord, which is effectively, if you see something, you see an insect or another species, and you have a photo of it, you can submit that as a record, especially if you have an idea of what you think it is, through the iRecord app. And it's showing you the location, how many you've seen and where. And the one on the right is the iRecord butterflies app. So this is a really great one if you want to get into butterflies, and it's got a lovely guide as well to recognising the different butterflies, I think. Cool. When you were saying you've used it yourself. And then something a little bit different. So the iRecord is about single records observations of an individual. This is a survey which I run as part of the Pollinator monitoring scheme across the UK and actually globally as well. We've got the FitCount app. So the FitCount, flower insect time count, is a 10-minute survey. So we're trying to do something that's repeated over time, simply counting the number of insects that visit a patch of flowers in that 10-minute period. You do it in an area of 50 by 50 centimetres, which is that big, so you can use a little tape, we call this a quadrat, to create your area. And the important thing is you're not trying to recognise all the different insects you're seeing to species. You're recording them to group level, so differentiating between bumblebees, solitary bees, hoverflies, beetles, butterflies and so on, a bit like we were looking at just earlier. Lots of people have enjoyed doing fit counts on the RHS gardens. You can do these anywhere. You can use the app anywhere, gardens, countryside. We've worked with some volunteers on flower-rich road verges in Derbyshire. And again, these are my colleagues out in Brazil who use the Fit Count app with groups out there to count some of the pollinators that they have. So yeah, this is a survey that starts up on the 1st of April. So if you're keen to download the FitCount app, there's QR code there, but also I've got some flyers and some posters here. Again, you can pretty much take part anywhere, in your garden, in a park, repeatedly over time. You can do as many as you like, but it's a really enjoyable way of engaging and just slowing down a little bit and absorbing what you're seeing, visiting those flowers.
And in terms of people doing their own thing Alun's got this meadow, I've got a patch of Pollinator and lots of dead wood lying around. If everyone does this and they're all joined up, they're close to other ones, little refuges, they help.
Absolutely, having a bit of connectivity between these habitats is important. We know some of these insects can only move so far. So having the sort of work that Alun's doing on your meadow and even in gardens, again, if we can all do something in our garden, even just leaving a little bit of lawn unmown in May, get those dandelions going, we should really be celebrating some of these flowers and not constantly mowing them. Having little bits of messy corners in your garden, and then if you want, again, sowing some of the plants that are recommended for pollinators, and there are lots of places for advice on those as well. So.
Yeah, you won't regret it, just leaving a bit of untidy garden. It is untidy beauty, and I think the magic of it is there's constant change throughout the season. So, as one poet said, it's never finished, but it's always perfect.
Beth, do you have a little corner of your garden? Or?
I do. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and she's really got into the idea of bee hotels. I'm not sure how effective our bee hotel is, but just trying to get young people especially interested and trying to have a section of your garden. There's lots of small things that people can do. Yeah.
Well, unless anyone's got any questions. Right. How do I do this?
So, is the mic working? Is it? I can't hear if it is.
You don't need it in here.
Yeah.
It's just for online.
Yeah.
Is it working? There we go.
Yeah.
So we've got one question which says, where is the meadow in Exeter that Alun is rewilding?
Yeah, it's near Bovey Tracy, outside of Bovey Tracy, which is it's in the Dartmoor National Park. If anybody wants to visit this meadow or a great variety of them, just go to the Moor Meadows website. That's MOOR Meadows, and that is a community group. We have more than 500 members, many, many meadows, and they're, thanks to the marvellous energy of the lady who started this, we are linking them all up on the map. So we're trying to, fill in places and encourage people to have a meadow, whether it's the size of a tablecloth or there's 10 acres, and they're all coming together. And the idea of these community collaborations to spread, as you were saying, meadows everywhere, that too is spreading, and more meadows groups are appearing here, there, and everywhere.
And then we've also...
This is welcome.
Sorry. We've also got, please could you repeat the names and organisations of the speakers, as this is not on the Eventbrite event info.
Yeah. Beth, introduce yourself.
Sure, so I am Dr. Beth Mortimer, and I am Associate Professor in Animal Biology at the University of Oxford.
I'm Dr. Claire Carvell. I'm an ecologist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology.
And I'm Dr. Alun Anderson, and I'm seriously retired. But, I was at Oxford and I was at New Scientist, other places.
Cool, thank you. And there's just one last one on here which says, is iRecord specific to the UK? I have been using iNaturalist. Does this not go anywhere useful?
So iRecord is specific to the UK, although we've got some apps that are going wider across Europe, particularly with butterflies. iNaturalist is much more global. They are all going somewhere useful. iNaturalist tends to go to GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. But it is actually a good question, because there are some quite complex routes by which some of these data get through. But if you're submitting via either iRecord or iNaturalist, you're guaranteed that your data are going somewhere useful.
Thank you. That's it for online. Was there anyone who had a question in here?
Go on.
Oh, God. Right at the back as well.
You said that wasps get a bad reputation for no reason. I'm not sure that's true, having been stung by wasps multiple times. Why do you think there's no reason for the bad reputation?
So that's a question where actually my colleague Serian Sumner, who's written the most fabulous book about wasps, is the person to really celebrate wasps. So Endless Forms. If you want to understand wasps, Serian Sumner's book, Endless Forms, is one place to start. But wasps, there are some risks, and we do have the 9 species of social wasp in the UK that have these huge colonies and can be a bit scary when they're stinging. But actually, if you know how to avoid them, respect them, again, that's one thing. But again, thousands of other wasps which are either solitary, going about their business on their own, or parasitic. And again, they've all got incredible life histories, and they are amazing to watch and to look at as well. Plus, as we were saying, they don't have to do a job, but they actually are doing something very useful in the ecosystem. And in the case of wasps, they need to eat insects as their prey, to take back to their nest. So they are sort of nature's pest controllers out there, eating the larvae on your lettuces or in your garden. They have so many wonderful things to celebrate.
I mean, in the same way as we don't say, or most of us don't say, we shouldn't have lions or tigers, even though they're terrifying. I think you just have to accept that, particularly with these small things, which on the whole hurt. I mean, I remember I literally stirred a hornet's nest and suffered as a result of it quite badly. But, they were in some rotten log somewhere or something, and they were keeping nature ticking over, I think, is my feeling. They're all part of keeping the system going.
Yeah, the balance, absolutely.
Well, let's wind up there. Thank you so very much, Beth, Claire and Alun.
Thank you.